Today we are going back to the late 18th century and early 19th century to look at a case about a lady named Mary Bateman who lived in England. She was also known as the Yorkshire Witch. Mary Bateman was born at Topcliffe in Yorkshire, England in 1768. Her father was a farmer and both her parents were well respected. From a very young age, Mary stole things wherever she went, even things she didn't really need. The stealing habit didn't stop. As an attempt to put Mary on a more law-abiding path, when she was 13, her parents sent her to work as a domestic servant in a large house. She started her work quite well, but soon started stealing from her employer and was dismissed. She was then dismissed from her next employer and her reputation started to spread, so no one wanted to employ her. Out of necessity, Mary moved to the city of Leeds. Here she soon found work as a dressmaker and she was quite good at her role. Pay, however, was quite low, so resourceful Mary supplemented her income by becoming a soothsayer. Sooth is an Old English word which means truth, and a soothsayer is what we would probably refer to today as a fortune teller. When Mary was 24 years old, she met John Bateman, who was a wheelwright, and after a quick 3-week courtship they married. They had 4 children, including her son, also christened John. Within 2 months of her marriage, Mary was again on the wrong side of the law for the many crimes she had committed. But she always was one step ahead of them and she always managed to escape arrest and prosecution by persuading her husband to move frequently from place to place. Her husband John, however, tired of his wife's constant tricks and schemes, so joined the supplementary militia. This meant that he worked away from his Leeds home for months on end and that Mary was reliant on herself to generate the income she needed to live on and bring up 4 children. By 1799, Mary was living in Marsh Lane, Leeds, and without any real trade she started to focus on her fortune-telling and claimed that she had supernatural powers. She made and sold potions that were supposed to cure various illnesses and ward off evil spirits. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was still a popular belief in the power of witchcraft, and quick-thinking Mary found she could cash in on it. It was a far more profitable and certainly less dangerous way of making money than stealing, as at the time stealing was punished by hanging. It might seem incredible to us today that a relatively uneducated woman who was a career criminal could successfully convince a large number of people that she possessed supernatural powers and healing abilities. But Mary certainly succeeded in doing so. In 1803, Mary sold medicines to 2 sisters who lived above their draper's shop with their mother in St. Peter's Square. Mary sold the medicines, which were in fact a mixture of poisons. When the 3 of them died, Mary calmly robbed their house and shot. When the neighbors asked why the women had died, she told them that they had caught bubonic plague. Amazingly, there was no inquest and no suspicion on Mary, so she just walked away from the crime and sold everything that she had stolen from the house. After this crime, Mary decided to go to the hospital. But it would be good to use an alias with all her scams. So she invented a character named Mrs. Moore. This non-existent lady was always consulted on behalf of Mary's clients. All clients were told that the money she took from them was to go to Mrs. Moore. By 1806, clients thought it strange, but no one had ever seen Mrs. Moore. So Mary had to invent a new alias and named her Mrs. Blythe. By this time, she had moved to the Bramley area of Leeds, where she met a wealthy childless middle-aged couple named William and Rebecca Perigo. Rebecca was apparently suffering from dizziness whenever she laid down and was also having psychological problems, claiming to be haunted by a black dog and other spirits. She was told by her doctor that she was under a spell and that he was unable to help her. In about June 1806, the Perigos were visited by their niece, who suggested that they employ help from Mary, who she said will be able to assist her aunt to get rid of the spirits that were possessing her. As a result, a meeting was arranged between the Perigos and Mary outside the ironically named Black Dog Pub. Of course, Mary saw this as a very big money-making opportunity. Mary listened to Mrs. Perigo's problems and explained that she was just a messenger for Mrs. Blythe. She told the unsuspecting couple that she would need an item of underclothing from Mrs. Perigo, which she would send to Mrs. Blythe in Scarborough, who would be able to connect with Mrs. Perigo through the clothing to find a solution to stop the dizziness and end the black dog haunting. William Perigo took the petticoat to Mary, who promised to send it to Mrs. Blythe and told William to come and see her the following week. The following week, William arrived as promised and Mary showed him a letter from Mrs. Blythe. The imaginary Mrs. Blythe had instructed that Mary should go to the Perigos' house and sew 4 1-guinea notes and some gold coins, which she had sent into each corner of Rebecca's bed, where they were to be left for 18 months. A guinea is about £1 and 10 pence. William was to give Mary 4 guinea notes in exchange to return to Mrs. Blythe. And remember, she had worked as a dressmaker, so was very good at sewing. The notes were sewn into the bed, and William was instructed to visit Mary regularly to receive further instructions from Mrs. Blythe. The next instruction was that William should nail 2 horseshoes to the door. William was soon to receive a letter from Mrs. Blythe instructing him to take Mary further 2 guinea goats and to purchase cheese to be sent to her by Mary. The letter was to be burned after he had read it. The next letter requested a small quantity of china and silverware to be sent to Mrs. Blythe, together with some tea and sugar. Again, the letter was to be burnt. The next request was for a bed and bedclothes, as Mrs. Blythe was unable to sleep in her own bed due to the problems she was having with the spirits that had taken over Mrs. Perigo. The letter was to be immediately burnt after all this had been actioned. The letters continued. The following one predicted an illness in the Perigos' house affecting one or both of them. It instructed Mrs. Perigo to take half a pound of honey to Mary, who would mix it with some special medicine that Mrs. Blythe had made. The letter also stated that the Perigos were to eat puddings for 6 days, and they were to mix into each of the puddings a packet of powder that Mary would give them. The Perigos began eating the puddings. Interestingly, the letter said, but only 1 pudding was to be made each day. Nobody else was to be allowed to eat any of it, and that if there was any left over, it must be immediately destroyed. It also said, but should William or Rebecca become ill, they were not to go to the doctor because he would be unable to help. Unsurprisingly, this letter, like its predecessors, was to be burnt. So Mary's plan was that the Perigos would poison themselves and destroy all the evidence of Mary's involvement. You may wonder how an adult couple could be so naive in the early 1800s, but Mr. Perigo just wanted his wife to be cured. And his doctor had already informed him that his wife was possessed and was unable to cure her. The couple began eating the puddings with no ill effects, but on the 6th day they tasted a little different, and it caused William and Rebecca Perigo to have severe stomach cramps and vomiting. As directed, a doctor was not consulted, and Rebecca died a horrible death on the 24th of May, 1807. Her husband William, however, did consult a doctor who suspected that Rebecca could have been poisoned, but no postmortem was carried out. William Perigo stopped eating the puddings and started to recover. Mary had been very clever up to this time. Through Mrs. Blythe, she continued to demand items of value from the Perigos, but no more than she assessed that they could afford. In view of William's successful business, William Perigo decided to examine the little silk purses that contained the guinea notes and gold coins that Mrs. Blythe had asked to have sewn into Rebecca's bed. Would they still contain the notes and coins that had been placed in them? He looked, but instead they contained cabbage leaves and copper coins. William finally started to realize that he had been deceived by Mary. William then arranged a meeting with Mary, saying he wanted to purchase another bottle of medicine, but he also went to see the local constable. At the meeting, Mary bought a little bottle of liquid containing oatmeal and arsenic. Mary had a problem, as William had lived rather than died, as she had planned, but with the oatmeal and arsenic she would now be able to finish him off. The constable, however, very quickly saw what Mary was doing and took Mary into custody, and followed this by searching her house, where he found many of the items that the Perigos had given to Mary to be sent to the imaginary Mrs. Blythe. The constable was not a naive man, and Mary appeared before the magistrates the following day, charged with Rebecca's murder. They committed her for trial, and on Friday, March 17, 1809, at York Castle, she came before the judge, Sir Simon Leblanc. Evidence of the handwriting was submitted, which showed Mrs. Blythe's letters were identical to Mary's. Forensic evidence was provided, which analyzed the remains of the honey and found that it mercuric chloride, which was extremely poisonous and was consistent with the symptoms displayed by the Perigos. Mary's defense was very simple. She just denied any involvement with Mrs. Perigo's death. Sir Simon Leblanc summoned up and told the jury that to bring in a guilty verdict they had to satisfy themselves on 3 points. These were that Rebecca Perigo had died from poisoning, that the poison had been administered with the knowledge of Mary, and that it had been done with the aim of causing Rebecca Perigo's death. He went on to remind the jury that although there was a strong case against Mary for having systematically defrauded the Perigos, this did not make her automatically guilty of murder. The evidence of criminality and murder was so overwhelming that it did not take the jury long to deliver its verdict of guilty. In accordance with the usual procedure, Mary was asked if she had anything to say as to why sentence of death should not be pronounced on her. With teary eyes, she told the judge that she was pregnant. As a result, the judge ordered the court doors to be locked and got a doctor to examine her. Mary was found not to be pregnant. and the judge proceeded to sentence her to be hanged and afterwards dissected on the following Monday. Mary was aged 41 at the time and had an infant child with her in prison up till the time she was condemned. Over the weekend, Mary wrote a letter to her husband in which she enclosed her wedding ring and asked him to give it to their daughter. She admitted some of her crimes but continued to deny the murders. It was reported in a Leeds newspaper that she continued her criminal habits even in the condemned cell, telling the fortune of other inmates for a guinea. Mary was executed on Monday the 20th of March, 1809 in front of a very large crowd who had gathered to see her. Many still believed she had supernatural powers and there was some sympathy for her. Many also believed that she would be saved from death by some divine intervention, but this was not to be. Mary continued to deny any involvement in the murder and her other criminal activities to the end. After execution, Mary's body was sent to the Leeds Royal Infirmary for dissection and afterwards put on display. The public paid 3 pence each to view her body, and £30 was raised for the hospital. Her skeleton, together with her body, was taken to the hospital. With a plaster cast of her death mask were put on display and can be seen today at the Thackeray Museum in Leeds. John Billington was born in the English county of Lincolnshire around 1580. At the time of his birth, Queen Elizabeth I was on the English throne. This was a time when most of the population lived in small villages and made their living from farming. However, towns and cities were starting to grow larger and more important. Trade and industry was growing rapidly, and England was becoming a more commercial country. The mining of coal, tin, and lead flourished. So did the iron industry. And as they flourished, England became richer and richer. This period is often referred to as the Golden Age. As England grew more prosperous, life for the well-off became more comfortable. Upper-class and middle-class people benefited from the growing wealth of the country and they started looking overseas for further ways to increase their wealth. However, for the poor in Elizabethan England, life did not improve. For them, life was hard and tough. Like many poor people at the time who lived in the countryside, John Billington came to work in London. And they had 2 sons named John Jr. and Francis. The Elizabethan period came to an end on the 24th of March, 1603, upon the death of the Queen, and James I became King of England, starting the Jacobean era. The Jacobean era was far from golden, and many people lived in terrible conditions. The era ended with a severe economic depression. John Billington found it hard to provide for his family and lived in debt and on the brink of poverty. In order to try and improve his circumstances, he made a deal with a prominent London businessman which enabled him and his family to travel to America on board the ship, the Mayflower. It was agreed that he would sail to Virginia, and on the ship's arrival in Virginia, he and his family would work on behalf of the colony. Until 1627. A 7-year contract tying him to the colony was a big commitment, but John calculated that life in the New World must be better than his impoverished existence in London. On September 16, 1620, the Mayflower left Plymouth, England bound for America with 102 passengers on board, including the Billington family. The ship was heading for Virginia. John Billington, who was loyal to the Church of England, soon realized that he was vastly different from many of his fellow passengers. 35 of them were members of the radical English separatist church who were traveling to America to escape the jurisdiction of the Church of England, which they found corrupt. 10 years earlier, English religious persecution had led a group of separatists to go and live in self-exile in Holland in search of religious freedom. However, many were dissatisfied with their economic opportunities in Holland and under the direction of their leader, William Bradford, decided to emigrate. Virginia, where an English colony had been founded in Jamestown in 1607. The separatists had financial backing from a group of investors called the London Adventurers who had promised a sizable share of the colony's profits. As the Mayflower had been delayed, leaving England by 1 month, the journey to America was very difficult and the ship encountered rough seas and storms. The conditions resulted in the Mayflower being blown off course by more than 500 miles. On November the 21st, 1620, after a 66-day voyage, the ship landed on the tip of Cape Cod at what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts. As the supplies were running low and the storms and high winds continued, it was decided to draft a document to serve as a basis for self-government known as the Mayflower Compact and settle in Cape Cod instead of trying to continue their journey to Jamestown. During the journey across the Atlantic, John Billington had made multiple enemies and had already established a reputation as a troublemaker. His son Francis also left an indelible impression on his fellow passengers, firing his father's gun near a powder keg in the ship's crowded cabin on December 5, 1620. A rash act that resulted in a fire on board and could have sunk the ship before most of the passengers had even set foot on American soil. Upon establishing camp, the settlers went on to face the harsh realities of a New England winter. Nearly half of them died during this time, which left the population to about 50. The Billington family all survived the winter, and when spring came, the two boys were soon off exploring their new home. Francis, hoping to discover a new ocean, found a small lake behind the town that was given the name Billington Sea, which I believe it is still called today. John Jr. became lost in the woods and turned up on Cape Cod after a search party was sent out to find him. In March 1621, John Billington was brought before the company and charged with contempt of the captain's lawful command with abusive speeches when called to perform military duty. But he escaped punishment as this was his first offense, and he expressed some humility during his hearing. In April 1621, Governor Carver collapsed while working in the fields on a hot day. He died a few days later. The settlers of Plymouth then chose William Bradford as the new governor. This was not good for John Billington, as the new governor didn't like his attitude, unlawful behavior, or his religion. In 1622, there was an unexplained that destroyed 4 houses. Many considered John to be responsible, but this was only due to his reputation, as there was no evidence to suggest that he was the culprit. John was in trouble again in 1624 when John Oldham and John Lifford were banished from Plymouth for writing letters critical of the colony. When questioned before the governing council, John Billington, no proof was actually found against him, and when questioned, John said he had no knowledge of the plot and was never officially charged. Shortly after, John's wife, Eleanor, was found guilty of slander and sentenced to a whipping. After the issue of the exile of John Oldham and John Lifford died down, John Billington's anti-government agitation continued. In 1626, the people of the colony received full ownership of the plantation, so they divided the land among themselves. John Billington did not receive a particularly good deal, receiving a modest house, 63 acres of land, and future land rights. His lack of social status, loyalty to the Church of England, and repeated run-ins with authorities seemed to have made him a permanent outsider. In 1630, John Billington was caught in an argument with his neighbor, John Newcomen. Records are unclear as to just why or how this argument started. A few days later, Newcomen was seen leaving the town, and shortly afterwards, John Billington was observed heading in the same direction. Later that day, Newcomen was found dead. He had been shot. John Billington was accused of the crime. He apparently had a motive, and according to the governor, William Bradford, the weapon used could be traced to him. John was tried by a jury who found him guilty of willful murder, and the governor, William Bradford, concluded that Billington should be sentenced to death by hanging. Governor Bradford was probably not reluctant to hang John Billington, given his past activity as a leading dissident in Plymouth. There was a substantial legal question as to whether the local authorities governing the Plymouth colony possessed criminal jurisdiction sufficient to impose capital punishment. William Bradford was able to persuade John Winthrop, the newly appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to concur in the death sentence, that the conviction was based solely on circumstantial evidence. John Billington may have quarreled with Newcomen, but researchers for the Society of Mayflower Descendants have questioned the accuracy of Bradford's commentary on the trial, observing that the governor obviously disliked and criticized the entire family from the beginning. John Billington was hanged not far from Plymouth Rock and buried in an unknown location. He was the first recorded murderer in what would become the United States of America. Today we are going back over 100 years to Edwardian England to look at the crimes of George Joseph Smith. George Smith was born in London on January 11, 1872. His father was an insurance agent, and while his family were not rich, they were financially comfortable. George was born in Bethnal Green, London, and when he was 9, he was sent to a reformatory in Gravesend as he was caught stealing. The punishment was designed to be a short, sharp shock treatment to stop young children from offending again. But for George Smith, being locked up for 7 years from the age of 9 to 16 led to what many considered to be a harsh punishment on a boy so young. Far from serving as a deterrent, being locked up did not deter George Smith from going on to commit far more serious crime. He probably learned a lot from his fellow inmates, such as how to use false identities and how to commit fraud. In 1898, George married Caroline Beatrice Thornhill, but he used a false name, Oliver George Love. She was 18 and probably thought she was marrying a prosperous businessman who owned a bread shop. The shop, however, went bankrupt, so Caroline started working as a maid for a number of employers, stealing from them before leaving. In order to stay one step ahead of the law, they moved to Brighton and Eastbourne so Caroline could continue to work as a maid and steal from her employers. When George instructed Caroline to pawn some stolen jewelry, she was arrested when a suspicious pawnbroker called the police. She went to prison for a year while George just disappeared. When Caroline was released from prison after serving a 12-month sentence, she by complete chance saw George. So she called the police. He was arrested and due to Caroline's statement, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison in January 1901. They never got divorced, but Caroline then emigrated to Canada. After Caroline went to Canada, George went on a campaign of bigamy, marrying different women always for money. He would either persuade them to hand over their money, usually saying it was for a business venture, or he would insure their lives. Once he had what he wanted, he would simply disappear, leaving victims with broken hearts and empty bank accounts. He was lucky, as in the early 20th century, large numbers of young men had emigrated to countries such as Australia and Canada, which meant that by 1910 British females outnumbered men by more than 500,000. The newspapers are full of stories about women who could not find husbands. Such spinsters were perfect prey for George. He was smooth-talking, slim, with muscular physique and always wore brightly colored boat eyes. He liked to walk along seafront promenades and parks in search for lonely and vulnerable women. In the summer of 1910, he was walking in Clifton, Bristol, when he met Bessie Munday, a woman in her mid-30s. Her father, who had been a bank manager, had died, and she had inherited £2,500, which today would be about £280,000. George introduced himself as Henry Williams. He said that he worked as a picture restorer in London. They went out together for walks, and very soon after they met, they were married at a registry office in Weymouth. George, however, was unable to get his hands on her money as it had been placed in the hand of trustees. He did manage to persuade Bessie to give him £150 in cash. When she did, he left, accusing her of infecting him with a venereal disease. 18 months later, Bessie was walking in a popular seaside resort of Weston-super-Mare, and she saw George. They spoke, and she was very happy to take back her husband after he explained that having contracted a venereal disease, he considered it best to leave rather than pass it on to her. He told her that he had been looking for her for a long time and would like to continue the marriage. In May 1912, the couple moved to Herne Bay in Kent, and George persuaded his wife to make a will, leaving everything to him. Afterwards, they visited an ironmonger and purchased a cast iron bath. George then convinced his wife that she was an epileptic and on Friday, July the 12th, took her to see the doctor. Bessie had no history of fits, but agreed to be examined by the local doctor and repeat the symptoms that George had described to her. The following morning, the doctor received a pencil-written note from George. "Come at once," it read, "my wife is dead." The doctor arrived to find Bessie on her back in the bath, her face still partially submerged. George claimed this was how he found her. The doctor attributed the death to drowning, and George was awarded the full inheritance of £2,500 by an inquest jury. Despite his sudden wealth, George did not spend much on the funeral. He chose the cheapest coffin and refused to pay for a private plot, so Bessie had to be buried in a common grave. He even returned the bath to the ironmonger and obtained a refund. With a murder weapon disposed of, it seemed George had committed the perfect crime. But he had overlooked one thing. Unbeknown to him, Bessie was holding a bar of soap in her right hand when she died, and the doctor had noted that her fingers remained clamped tightly round it. Just over a year later, in November 1913, George married 25-year-old Alice Burnham, who was a nurse. They met in Southsea. On their wedding day, November the 4th, he took her to a doctor who certified that she was healthy enough to take out a £500 insurance policy on her life, with George the sole beneficiary. The same pattern followed. He also persuaded her to make a will, leaving everything to him. They went to Blackpool on a belated honeymoon and found accommodation with a bathroom at Mrs. Crosley's. George's wife had cause to see a doctor, and George told the doctor that his wife was suffering from persistent headaches. On the evening of Friday, December the 12th, 3 days after they arrived in Blackpool, George was talking to Mrs. Crosley in the kitchen when they noticed small drops of water leaking through the kitchen ceiling while Alice was upstairs having a bath. George quickly went upstairs and discovered his wife dead in the bath. Once again, there were no signs of anything suspicious. Very little was spent on the funeral. The inquest jury decided that Alice had drowned after fainting, so George inherited £600. At the time of her death, they had been married just over a month. George carried on his bigamous ways, and in November 1914, he met Margaret Lofty of, in all places, the English city of Bath. This time, George used the name John Lloyd. They married on December 18, 1914. After they got married, they began a brief honeymoon in Highgate, North London, with George again insisting that his new wife see a local doctor on their wedding night. The first evening there, George played some music on the piano in the living room. Then he left the house telling the landlady that he was going out to buy some tomatoes. On his return, strangely, he rang the bell so the landlady would let him in even though he had a key. He went upstairs where he discovered the drowned body of his wife. Again, there was no money spent on the funeral. George claimed the insurance payment, but this time there was a delay because one of her witnesses was ill. Strange deaths at seaside resorts were always reported in local newspapers in Edwardian Britain and were always read by local people. But a bride drowning on her honeymoon in a bath in London featured in national newspapers and was read about all over the country by readers like Charles Burnham, Alice Burnham's father, and William Haynes in Blackpool, who lived near to Mrs. Crosley where Alice was murdered. The husbands involved had different names, but in each case were newly married and in each case had discovered their wives dead in the bath. On receiving letters from the public, the Metropolitan Police looked at the similarities with the death of Alice Smith and Margaret Lofty and decided it was probably not a coincidence. So they gave the case to a highly skilled detective named Arthur Neal. Inspector Neal was certain that Mr. Smith and Mr. Lloyd were the same person, and by piecing together their movements across the country over the previous years, he discovered the case of Bessie Munday, who died exactly the same way in 1910 in Herne Bay. In the Margaret Lofty case, Inspector Neal quickly discovered that a will had been made in which the sole beneficiary was her husband. The inspector contacted the coroner named Dr. Bates, who had examined the body, and he revealed that he had been contacted by an insurance company in Yorkshire. On speaking to the insurance company, they confirmed that Margaret Lofty had taken out a life insurance policy worth around £700 with her new husband as sole beneficiary. The inspector also found that Alice Smith had taken out a similar life insurance policy shortly before she died, hoping that George, or as he called himself, Mr. Lloyd, would want to collect the money. Inspector Neal instructed the doctor to issue a favorable report to the insurance company. On the 1st of February 1915, a man fitting the description of both Smith and Lloyd appeared to collect the money. Inspector Neal was there. Inspector Neal asked if he was John Lloyd. He confirmed this. But when asked if he was also George Smith, he vigorously denied this but was nevertheless arrested for making a false entry on a marriage certificate. While George was in custody, Home Office pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was tasked with exhuming the victims and establishing whether they drowned and, if this was the case, whether they drowned by force. No evidence was found of foul play, but the fact that Bessie Munday was still holding on to a bar of soap when she died was interesting, as if she really had suffered a fit or fainted. As the inquest had suggested, her hand would have relaxed and let the soap go. This suggested that she, and by implication the other woman, had died very suddenly without time to put up a fight. The big question, however, was how did George drown his wives without them screaming or putting up a fight? Spilsbury came up with was that George had pulled their legs so quickly out of the bath. He sent their heads underwater so fast, but they lost consciousness instantly. Modern science gives some credibility to this theory. Other people suggested that George had first hypnotized his victims. George Joseph Smith was formally charged with the 3 murders and went on trial at the Old Bailey in London on June 22, 1915. Although he could only be tried for the murder of Bessie Williams in accordance with English law, the prosecution used the deaths of the other 2 to establish a pattern of George's crimes. This was allowed by Mr. Justice Scruton despite the protests of George's counsel. George decided not to give evidence in his own defense. Caroline Thornhill, who was still George's lawful wife, turned up to watch for trial. George was very confident of acquittal, although he lost his temper at one point, telling the court during police evidence that he had not committed murder and could not be sentenced to death. Then came the testimony of Dr. Spilsbury. Bath used for the murder of Alice Burnham was produced, and the pathologist prepared to demonstrate how, in his view, George had drowned his brides. The jury were taken to a private room to see a young woman model wearing a bathing costume. She stepped and reclined into the bath. Dr. Spilsbury then suddenly raised her legs and the water rushed up her nose and into her mouth. It was so effective that she had to be revived by artificial resuscitation. There was no doubt that George Smith had both the motivation and the character to commit this trio of murders. After an 8-day trial, the jury took just 22 minutes to find George guilty and he was sentenced to death. George appealed against the verdict, but the appeal was dismissed. On the August 13, 1915, George was hanged in Maidstone prison protesting his innocence to the end and taking with him the secret of how he killed his 3 wives. Today we are going to 1960s London to look at a case that many people say toppled the British government. John Profumo was a British soldier and politician born in 1915. He attended Oxford University and in 1940 he became the 5th Baron Profumo of Italy, having succeeded his father. He was a British MP from 1940 to 1963 and was an army officer during the war. He was appointed Secretary of War by the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in 1960. As War Minister, he was in charge of overseeing the British Army. The post was a junior cabinet position, but he looked a good candidate for future promotion. He was a wealthy politician and was even a personal friend of Queen Elizabeth. He undoubtedly had an aristocratic background. In 1960, he married Valerie Hobson, a famous actress. He was a man of great education, wealth, and power. Stephen Ward was born in 1912 in Hertfordshire. His family had a clerical and military background. His father was a vicar, so his upbringing was centered around religion. He was educated in Dorset at Canterford School, one of the most expensive boarding schools in the country. He was, however, seen as a lazy student who achieved very little in his time there. In 1929, he left the UK and went to the United States to study at Kirksville College to become an osteopath. However, it wasn't until the late 1930s that he became a qualified osteopath due to him returning to London and working in various different fields of work. He served in the British Army during the war, where his skills became known to all around him. In 1944, he was posted to India, and in October 1945, Ward returned to England after being discharged from the army due to a disability. Being an osteopath allowed him to quickly grow a large social circle, having clients from all walks of life, sports people and people in show business. He frequently attended parties and hosted various ones of his own. Yevgeny Ivanov was born in Russia on the 11th of January, 1926. In 1944, he joined the Red Navy and was trained by the Soviet military intelligence. In 1960, he was posted to London as an assistant naval attaché. He was accompanied by his wife, Maya. The British MI5 saw him as a Russian spy and tried to make him change allegiance and side with them. However, this proved to be unsuccessful. Christine Keeler was born in London in the year 1942. She had a very different upbringing to Profumo, Ward, and Ivanov. Her childhood was difficult and she experienced many hardships. When she was just a young child, her father deserted the family, leading to Christine and her mother living in a converted railway carriage near Windsor. Throughout her teenage years, she was sexually abused by her mother's lover and his friends. When she left school, her future didn't look promising. She had no qualifications and was in and out of different jobs. Christine was a very beautiful girl and men would always approach her with no qualifications or a trade. She eventually found a job in a nightclub called Marie's, serving drinks and posing on stage for the clients. It was one of those nights when Christine was working at Moray she met Stephen Ward, and soon after their first meeting she moved into his flat. Their relationship, however, was purely platonic. They frequently attended parties together where Ward would introduce his friends to Christine. Over the weekend of the 8th and 9th of July, 1961, Lord Astor and his wife hosted a small house party at Cliverton, their country estate. Their guests included the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, and his wife. The same weekend, Stephen Ward was also hosting a house party at his country home, Spring Cottage, which was within the grounds of the estate. Ward's guests included Christine Keeler and her lover, for Soviet naval attaché. As it was a warm evening, Ward decided to take his friends to Lord Astor's house for a dip in the swimming pool, where they were discovered by Lord Astor and his guests. Stephen Ward introduced 46-year-old British government minister John Profumo to 19-year-old model Christine Keeler. Despite being a British politician and 27 years her senior, John Profumo found Christine very attractive and continually pursued her. A few weeks later, Christine and John became lovers. The relationship was at first very intense, but sometime before the end of 1961, Profumo ended the relationship. So in 1961, a young British girl was sleeping. The British government minister for war and a Russian spy. But the affair with John Profumo had ended and Christine got on with her life. In 1962, Christine started seeing Johnny Eckham, an ex-merchant seaman from Antigua. He was possessive and violent, so Christine ended the relationship due to his domineering behavior. Eckham hated the thought of Christine being with anyone else, so on the 14th of December, 1962, he arrived at Christine's flat demanding to see her. He fired several shots at the front door. The police were called, and shortly afterwards, Eckham was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The story of the shootings was given considerable coverage in the newspapers. And when Christine was questioned during a subsequent police investigation, details of her affair with John Profumo came public. She also omitted a concurrent relationship with Ivanov. When the Johnny Eckham trial started, Christine was due to give evidence but suddenly went missing. She had in fact gone to Madrid. By now it was March 1963 and Westminster and indeed the whole country was full of rumors about John Profumo's presence at wild parties and his association with Christine. And there were suggestions that she had been packed off to a hiding place in Madrid to avoid an embarrassing cross-examination which was aimed to protect people in high places. Questions were asked in the House of Commons about the suspicious and intriguing circumstances surrounding the missing witness, who had fled to Madrid and was eventually tracked down by newspaper reporters. A pretty young lady sleeping with both a British government minister and a Russian spy at the same time was something the members of Parliament for the opposition Labour Party were not going to let go. On March 21, 1963, a Labour MP for Dudley raised the issue in the House of Commons, inviting John Profumo to affirm or deny the rumors of his improprieties. This was apparently not to embarrass the Conservative government, but because of the Ivanov connection, which meant it was a matter of national security. Behind closed doors, however, British intelligence had already concluded that Profumo had not compromised national security in any way and also found little evidence implicating Ivanov as a spy. Nevertheless, the opposition Labour Party had raised the issue and Profumo had no choice but to stand up before Parliament on March 22 and make a statement. He denied all the charges, saying there was no impropriety whatsoever in his friendship with Ms. Keeler. He said that he would not hesitate to issue writs for libel and slander if scandalous allegations are made or reported about him. This statement was incredibly accepted by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Downing Street described the matter as closed. Profumo's convincing denial diffused for scandal for several weeks. In May, Dr. Stephen Ward went on trial in London on charges of prostituting Christine Keeler and other young women. In a highly sensationalized trial, Christine Keeler testified under oath about her relationship with Profumo. Ward also wrote to Harold Wilson, leader of the Labour opposition party, and confirmed that Profumo had lied to the House of Commons. On June 4, Profumo returned from a holiday in Italy and confessed to Conservative leaders that Miss Keeler had been his mistress. And in fact, his March 22 statement to the House of Commons was untrue. On June 5, he resigned as War Minister. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was widely criticised for his handling of the scandal. In the press and in Parliament, Macmillan was condemned as being old, out of touch and incompetent. In October, he resigned under pressure from his own government. He was replaced by Conservative Alec Douglas Hume, but in the general election of 1964 the Conservatives were swept from power by Harold Wilson's Labour Party. The Profumo affair is one of the most famous British scandals of the 20th century, and many claim that the scandal brought down the government. Stephen Ward went on trial in July 1963 and was abandoned by his society friends and exposed to the contempt and hostility of prosecuting counsel and judge. Despite the relative lack of evidence and dismissal of most of the charges against him, he was convicted on 2 counts of living off immoral earnings. However, before the verdict was announced, Ward took an overdose of sleeping pills and died 3 days later. 51 years later, in 2014, the trial verdict was put under review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. On December 6, 1963, Christine Keeler was jailed for 9 months for perjury. She had lied in court in an attempt to secure the conviction of another lover who she had met after her relationship with Profumo had ended. She was released in 1964 after serving 4.5 months in prison. She went on and had 2 brief marriages and produced 2 children. She largely lived alone. Most of the money she had made from newspaper stories due to the Perfumo case was spent on legal fees. Christine spent much of her later life as she had her childhood poor and living in social housing. Christine died on December 4, 2017, age 75. Ivanov was recalled to Moscow in December 1962 prior to the Perfumo affair becoming public knowledge. Upon returning to the Soviet Union, he continued his naval career, being assigned to the Black Sea Fleet. His wife, Maya, left him when his affair with Christine became public. He did not remarry and in 1994 was found dead in his Moscow flat at the age of 68. John Perfumo retreated from public life and dedicated himself to voluntary work, cleaning toilets at the charity Toynbee Hall in East London. He continued to work there for the next 40 years, only reluctantly taking on a more prominent role as chief fundraiser. The good work earned him redemption in the eyes of many, and in 1975 he was awarded the CBE. 20 years later, he sat next to the Queen at Margaret Thatcher's 70th birthday party. His wife stayed loyal to him through it all and also devoted herself to charity work until her death in 1998. John Perfumo died of a stroke at the age of 91. 2006. Today, we are going back to Singapore to look at a case that everyone was talking about in the 1960s. Sunny Ong was from a middle-class family. He was well-educated and well-spoken. He was attending teacher training college when he suddenly left in 1957 to join a government scholarship scheme to become a commercial pilot. The idea of becoming a pilot was far more glamorous and fast-paced in Ang's world. This didn't last and he was asked to leave the course because he ignored safety regulations. So he had left teacher training and failed to become a pilot. He then took part in the 1961 Singapore Grand Prix. Now, this was a tourism event, not the Formula One event it is today, but Ong was a skilled driver. The race was attended by rich, high-standing, and influential people. The type of people that Ong aspired to mix with. In 1962, he was arrested for negligent driving after killing a pedestrian. This was followed by being put on probation for attempted burglary. The same year, he started studying for a law degree, but shortly after starting, he was made bankrupt. Life for the young Ong, who wanted to be a wealthy, prosperous young man in the early 60s, wasn't going exactly as he had hoped. Jenny Chung Kid was a waitress at Odeon Bar and Restaurant. She was very different to Ong as she only had a basic education. For her work, she didn't earn very much money. Her main income was from the daily tips from customers. She lived with her 2 children and her husband, but the marriage was not a good one. Her main aspiration was to have a happy and fulfilling life. Jenny and Ong met in 1963. He was 24, she was 22. He was handsome and educated. She was naive and simple. She fell completely in love with Ong, who made out to be sophisticated and well-off. She left her husband and her unhappy married life. Soon after they met, Jenny left her job, and Ong borrowed a friend's car and drove his new girlfriend to Kuala Lumpur for a holiday. Jenny was really excited about the trip, but it was unfortunately cut short as the couple both became ill. However, before they returned to Singapore, Ong took out an insurance accident policy on himself and Jenny. $30,000 for himself and $100,000 for her. Remarkably, some may say, after taking out the policies, their car crashed on the way back from Kuala Lumpur, allegedly as a dog had run out onto the road. The passenger side of the car was damaged, but Jenny escaped the crash with minor injuries. The couple continued to date, and Jenny became increasingly infatuated with Ong. Ong decided to take out more accident insurance on Jenny, totaling $400,000. The beneficiaries were Ang's mother, who Jenny had only briefly met, or Jenny's estate, at the start of August 1963, and took Jenny to make a will, leaving her entire estate to his mother. Besotted and naive, Jenny just signed the paperwork, believing and to be a kind-hearted, perfect boyfriend. On Monday, August 26th, one of Jenny's policies expired. So Ong extended the policy for just 5 days. The policy gave twice for sum if he insured died from natural causes, but 4 times, or $160,000 if death was a result of an accident. The reason Ong gave as to why these policies were all short-term was because his girlfriend wanted to take up flying as she was the heiress of a chicken farm. This of course was not true, and Jenny had no income to pay the insurance premiums, but her boyfriend was paying them for her. It is estimated that the total sum insured was about $900,000. At 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday, August 27, 1963, Ong and Jenny chartered a boat with a boatman at Jardine Steps. They said they wanted to go diving and paid the boatman for the trip. They went out into Singapore Straits until Ong instructed the boatman to drop anchor near Sisters Island. Ong, who was in swimming trunks, had also brought along 3 air tanks, 2 pairs of small aqualung equipment, and a transistor radio. Ong dropped a guide rope and he helped Jenny put on a dive belt to which the axe, a knife, and a metal weight were attached. Jenny was a bit anxious as she had never dived before but entered the water alone. Some 10 minutes later she surfaced. Ong changed her tank and she went back into the water, still in his trunks. Ong started checking his own tank and found that it was leaking. He said the problem was with the washer and the boatman helped him improvise a new one, but it still would not work and Jenny was still somewhere underwater. Ong then tugged at the guide rope 3 times and asked, "Where's the girl?" The boatman said he did not know. Ong gave 3 more tugs. There were still no sign of his girlfriend. Ong pulled the rope up and told the boatman to look for air bubbles in the water. There were none. "What are we going to do?" Ong asked. The boatman suggested going to a nearby St. John's Island to call the police. He hauled anchor, circled a few times to look for bubbles, and then left for the island. Very strangely, neither the boatman or Ong entered the water to look for Jenny. They went to the island, but the boat was slow. Despite his girlfriend going missing, Ong was quite calm, never shouting at the boatman to speed up, and when they did arrive, he did not rush onto the island as a desperate boyfriend probably would have. Ong returned with a guard who suggested picking up some fishermen from a nearby island on his way back to where Jenny had gone missing. They returned with 5 fishermen, all of whom dived into the water to look for Jenny while Ong stayed in the boat. All that was recovered from Jenny was a single flipper worn by her. It had been set at the top and bottom, likely by a sharp instrument such as a knife or a razor blade. Diving experts said that the loss of a flipper would have affected the person's mobility. Jenny, being an unexperienced diver, would have panicked and probably drowned in the strong currents around the island. The police always suspected a skilled diver who didn't enter the water. He also stood to gain from the insurance policies he had purchased for Jenny shortly after they met. The police reclassified Jenny's disappearance as murder on the September 5, 1963. Their investigations finally led them to arrest Ong on the December 21, 1964, and he was charged with murder the next day. When Ang's case was mentioned in court on the December 29th, the magistrate rejected the prosecution's request for an adjournment to build their case and granted Ong a discharge, but a discharge that did not amount to an acquittal. However, Ong was rearrested an hour later and again charged with the crime. This time on the December 30th, the prosecution pressed for an extra adjournment, citing the seriousness of the alleged offense and the extra time they needed to prepare the case due to the circumstances. This time the magistrate accepted the prosecution application and disallowed bail. Following the preliminary inquiry, which lasted from the 25th of February to the 5th of March 1965, Ong was tried in the High Court before a 7-man jury between the 26th of April and the 18th of May. The case was very unusual as it was the first case in Singapore and Malaysia where there was no body. All the evidence presented was circumstantial. Expert witnesses testified that the waters around Sisters Island were dangerous due to strong undercurrents and that it was unsafe for a novice to dive alone in those waters. But Jenny had personal accident policies for over $450,000, a substantial amount in the 1960s. The policies were taken out within 3 weeks of Ong first meeting Jenny. The beneficiaries named in these policies were either Ang's mother or Jenny's estate. One of the insurance policies for the sum of $150,000 had lapsed on the 26th of August, had been extended on the morning of the August 27, 1963 for a further 5 days. Evidence was also produced that Ang did not renew or extend his own accident policy, which had been taken out at the same time. Another of Jenny's accident policies for the sum of $100,000 was due to expire on the August 28th, 1 day after she disappeared. It also transpired that Jenny had drawn up a will on August 7, 1963 at Brattles Brothers law firm and that she had been accompanied by Ong and that Ang's mother was named as a sole beneficiary. The representatives from insurance companies also testified that Ong had filed for claims with their companies on Jenny's insurance policies barely 24 hours after the disappearance of his girlfriend. Ang's actions on the day were highlighted. The fact he never entered the water to look for Jenny and did not seem anxious when she failed to resurface or display any urgency in getting help from nearby St. John's Island. But there was no body and Ong did not enter the water, so how could he have murdered his girlfriend if he hadn't entered the water? The trial concluded after 13 days. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours and on the 18th of May 1965 unanimously delivered the verdict of guilty to the murder of Jenny. Ong appealed the verdict, but all appeals were rejected. He petitioned for clemency to the President of Singapore, but this was also rejected on the 31st of January 1967. Ong was hanged on Monday, February 6, 1967. Jenny's body was never found.